Hi, hello everyone here and virtually. Thank you for coming for the last session of the conference. And I'm sure it's going to be one of the best sessions. So let's start. Yeah, let's start. And let me introduce the two presenters. One is remotely, Jimmy Pearson from Google, Salt Point in New York. Jimmy, do you hear us?
Yep, you're coming through great now. Thank you.
Thank you. And I rehearsed about your name. So, and Tansha from Peloton, Toronto. And their talk is about peer-to-peer learning at Google and Peloton, the power of internal experts. And in their talk, they will explore the benefits of developing internal experts through peer-to-peer learning programs, drawing on the experience of innovating learning organizations like Google and Peloton. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. Okay, so it's gonna be a bit of a blended presentation. Jimmy's joining us online, but welcome. We're really excited to be here. Reintroducing ourselves, but here we are. Okay, so what we're going to be covering, we're going to be talking a little bit about peer-to-peer learning, both at Peloton and Google. We'll kick things off by taking a look at peer-to-peer learning models versus traditional learning and professional development models. And then I'll dive into how we created a peer-to-peer learning program at Peloton. And Jimmy will explore how peer-to-peer learning has scaled at Google. Perfect. So let's start off by taking a look at traditional models of professional development. So usually in these models, you've got employees. So we call them team members at Peloton, endearingly. So you've got team members that are looking to learn something, and they're in a corporate work environment. They're no longer in a traditional university or college kind of setting, but they still have learning needs that they need in order to evolve and continue to do the work that they do every single day. And so when you think about a traditional professional development model, what you'll have is something external that you can offer employees. So that could be a third-party instructor-led training. So bringing folks into the business to teach them a skill. It could be an asynchronous learning platform. So there's tons and tons out there that, really serve this corporate audience. So you can think about things like O'Reilly, Pluralsight, Code Academy, LinkedIn Learning. These are all businesses that offer this type of learning for employees and professionals. External conferences like the one we're at right now. And then also external classes, right? So folks can choose to take university courses, different things like that. And all of these things have immense amount of value to corporate professionals that are continuing to learn and grow in their roles. But there are a few kind of gaps and tensions that exist in this model, mainly being that they're often pre-built, untailored, and require a large amount of time and financial commitment, not only from just the employees that are doing the learning, but also from the business. Let's take a look at the peer-to-peer learning model. So, Jimmy and I wrote an entire paper on this. We think there's an incredible amount of power in boosting the experts you already have within your own company. And so I'm going to dive through what those benefits are. First, we're thinking about hyper-relevant and organizationally specific context. So what I'm talking about here is there is certain level of context and information that you can only get inside your own company. Let me give you an example. You might have someone that's looking to learn leadership skills, and you can send them to an external conference to learn about leadership. There's tons and tons of companies and places that offer this. And, they might learn about coaching, they might learn different leadership principles, but then they have to go back and figure out, okay, how do I apply this within my own company? How do I apply this to the context of the business that we're currently in? What does leadership look like at my company? What are the things that we really value and how do I apply that? The same with technical skills, right? So you can have someone learn a new programming language, but now they got to figure out, okay, how do we use this programming language at our company? What are the code bases? How are they structured? And they've got to figure that kind of stuff out on their own. And that knowledge is only available within your organization because it's super, super specific. Columbia is not going to be able to do a class on how Peloton uses Kotlin because that's proprietary information, right? And that's only available inside the business. So that's one of the benefits. The other really interesting thing is that peer-to-peer learning is able to leverage a deep understanding of corporate culture that you can't get externally. So I could read everything there is to read about what it's like to work at Google. And there's lots and lots of articles out there about what it's like to work at Google. And I could go into Google and, try and run a session on learning, leadership or something like that at Google. But it's not going to be as good as if Jimmy does it, because Jimmy actually understands what it's like to work at Google. He understands the nuances of what it's like to be an employee there, the challenges, the trials and tribulations, all these types of things, and can really leverage that deep understanding of corporate culture to deliver context. I think this point in particular is really interesting, especially in technology. Both Jimmy and I are at technology companies, and there's a certain level of kind of instant credibility that you can get when you put an internal expert on stage and say, okay, you teach leadership versus bringing an external person in. One of the things that constantly comes up in a lot of our research is people really like learning from each other because of this credibility. They're like, well, they've worked at Peloton and they know what it's like to work here. So that credibility is really, really, really important because, as many of you know, when it comes to adult learning, there is that level of cynicism that you want to be able to overcome. And peer-to-peer learning does that in a really, really easy way. The other thing is, with a peer-to-peer learning model, it's pretty obvious to see where the benefit is to the learner. They're obviously getting this, this organizationally specific context, all this kind of stuff. But there's also a really, really great benefit for the people doing the teaching as well. So let's take someone who is an accountant. They do a lot of accountant-related things. I don't know. I barely talk to my finance department. But so, they're doing a lot of numbers, crunching, all this kind of stuff. They may not get the opportunity to do teaching, to do pairing, to do mentoring, to do coaching, to kind of flex these types of skills. And when you introduce peer-to-peer learning, they get an opportunity to do this in a really, really safe environment and kind of practice these skills before they go out externally to do something like this. And so there is that benefit there as well. And finally, we've got to talk about this in the economy that we're in. But peer-to-peer learning is also very scalable and cost-effective way to meet the learning objectives of your organization. And so when we say this, you can think about an example is when we think about instructor-led training, instructor-led training, having the folks inside your own business come in to do that type of training is, very scalable and cost-effective. In particular, we were just chatting a little earlier about going back to the office, what that experience has been like. And, as the world transitions into this sort of remote and hybrid work environment, there's a lot of research that's starting to show, employees are feeling a little disconnected and aren't feeling like they're able to make meaningful connections at work. And being able to leverage peer-to-peer learning creates those really meaningful conversations, right? Like if I'm learning about leadership from someone at Peloton, I now have them as a connection and I can reach out to them on our company Slack. I can send them an email. I can go for coffees with them regularly and continue to learn from them in ways that are a little bit more difficult to do when you're thinking about traditional models of professional development.
Can I jump in here for a second, Thansha?
Yeah, I was just going to toss it over to you.
Oh, wow. I'm sorry. Well, then in that case, I'm sorry for interrupting. And quick apology to everyone that I'm not there in person. I had planned to be, but I came down ill earlier this week. And I'm especially gutted because I've never actually gotten to meet Thansha in person. And so I'm sorry I'm not there. Oh, are y'all hearing me?
We hear you. Yep.
Okay. Well, I wanted to, now I'm bigger. I wanted to underline this point about scalability because Thansha spoke really eloquently about the kind of ancillary benefits of connection between employees and the knock-on benefits that can happen after those connections are made. But one of the things I really wanted to note is that there are certain learning objectives that are best served by instructor-led training, right? And are best served by live coaching and instruction. And an example I cite here is one of the big courses at Google that's really important to us right now is giving and receiving feedback. So for giving and receiving feedback, you can imagine, having live role-playing exercises paired with coaching is really, really important to achieving the learning objectives. So in addition to connection being worthwhile in and of itself, I'm sure there are plenty of experts at the conference who can speak more intelligently about this than me, but there are certain learning objectives which are best served by ILT. And so peer-to-peer is a way to scale that particular modality when, MOOCs or asynchronous options are not going to best serve the learning objective. Hopefully that got through. I'm not actually sure if I'm talking to the room right now.
We can hear you.
Okay, good. I see that there's a tech setup going on. So,
okay, let me just get the slide back on. Everyone can see this. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Jimmy. So well said. Okay, so let's chat a little bit about how we created a peer-to-peer learning program at Peloton. So for context for everybody, I lead the technical learning team at Peloton. And so mostly a lot of the learning that I do and that I focus on and the programs that we create are directly related to engineering, which we'll chat a little bit about why this reason is a little bit important later on.
Gotcha. I'm sorry to interrupt, but someone just raised this in the chat and I'm having the issue as well. Those of us joining remotely can't see the slides anymore.
Oh, okay.
Apologies for the technical difficulties.
That's okay. Okay, can you all see our fun slides now?
Good now, thank you.
Okay, amazing. Okay, cool. So when I first started at Peloton about a year ago, and I joined the business, baseline, did a little bit of a learning needs assessment. And one of the things that I came to learn is Peloton was leaning on a lot of external sources to fill learning gaps that existed between the business, which made a lot of sense because we didn't have a learning team that was focusing specifically on the needs of engineers and how they were learning and growing. So engineering managers were sending, folks to conferences, to classes. They were bringing people in. And the thing with engineers is they have a constant need to learn because technology is moving so quickly. And if they're not keeping up with the latest programming language, with the latest way to structure architecture, they're not going to be able to innovate and build the products that they need. So there was this need that was being filled by external resources, which was like, okay, that's great if that's working. But as we dug in and did a little bit more research, one of the things that we came to realize is that there was a bit of a missed connections thing happening. I don't know how many of you follow missed connections on the internet. Anyone? No? Okay. But we found that there was a little bit of a missed connections thing happening where we had team members that were looking to learn. And we had team members that had very strong technical skills and abilities within the business. And they weren't able to connect with each other. And so what was happening is we had our engineers going out to learn how to program in Kotlin. So Kotlin's a new technology that the business was really taking on and was critical that our engineers learned this programming language. And, engineers are pretty good at learning new programming languages. That's kind of what they do for a living. So our engineers were going out, learning these new skills and coming back to the business. But they were having a really hard time applying what they were learning to the actual work that they were doing. And so when we dug into this and said, okay, like why, is it Kotlin? Is the language actually too difficult? Is it our code bases? Like what's going on? Why is it so difficult? And one of the things we realized is our engineers were going out to these courses and they were getting a lot of baseline level skills. So if you ask this engineer, hey, can you program in Kotlin? They would say yes. But the thing that they were missing was how you do this at Peloton. And at Peloton, a lot of the use cases for Kotlin were much more advanced than what was available within, these external resources that they were going to conferences, classes, and, these platforms, right? So they were learning the baseline. But what we were doing at Peloton was very much at the bleeding edge of this technology. And, they were like, Thansha, I need to learn advanced Kotlin applied to Android. And, everything that says advanced Kotlin out there is not actually as advanced as I need it to be. What that meant for us was that we had people within the business that were doing this, right? These use cases existed within the business. These code bases existed within the business, but people weren't able to connect with each other to learn from each other. And so we really felt like that was a missed opportunity. And so we created our first peer-to-peer learning program at Peloton in the fall of 2021. And we called it the SME network. And what it is it's a group of internal experts who partnered with Tech Learning to coach and teach engineers. And so we gave our employees different ways that they could contribute, right? Everyone has different skills. And so this slide is actually a slide that we pulled from our technical onboarding program. When we were launching this program, we offered our engineers 3 different ways that they could contribute to the program. So they could write, so they could partner with us to create great technical content. So whether it was documentation, creating different onboarding exercises, whatever it was, they could write if they wanted, that was the skill that they wanted to flex. Or they could pair, right? So we do a lot of pair programming at Peloton. It's pretty common within the tech industry to do this as a way of learning. And so we offered a little bit of a longer commitment, but we offered engineers to come pair with each other to help new engineers ship their very first pull request, which is a pretty big milestone for engineers when they join a new company, to kind of hit that mark. And so we really wanted to have that be supported by peer-to-peer learning. And then finally, they could do the public speaking thing. So if they wanted to flex those public speaking muscles and get in front of an audience, we also offered them an opportunity to come speak at Tech Onboarding and talk about what it meant to be an engineer at Peloton and go through engineering culture. And you'll notice at the bottom of the slide here, we've got like hour blocks of how much people could contribute. And this was really important for us to do as well, because we really wanted engineers to be able to include this as a part of their traditional sprint planning model. So this wasn't something people were doing on top of their job, but something that people were doing as a part of their job, and really started thinking about how do we build this into the culture so that we create this kind of flywheel and create this learning culture at Peloton. And so we were obviously getting something from our subject matter expert network as a tech learning team. You know, we were able to identify learning needs, build programs, and then have our subject matter experts contribute to them. But we also wanted to make it enticing for people, right? Like, why should you do this? And so we wanted to support our experts as they supported their peers. And so we offered a couple different ways that we were supporting them. So first, we made sure that we shared this impact back with their managers. And so it kind of became a badge of honor. So, you know, if we had John create an onboarding exercise that now hundreds of engineers were going to be able to use to get to their first pull request in 3 days instead of 20 days, that is a direct result. That is a direct impact on the business bottom line. It impacts how quickly our engineers can innovate, deliver products faster to Peloton members. And so that gets shared back with managers. And we would make sure that we did that. And, you know, kind of doing this over the last year, one of the really nice things, we're at the end of our fiscal now. We're doing kind of performance evaluations. I've gotten a lot of managers come to me and say, hey, Thansha, can you write a promotion letter for so-and-so because of the work they did in the tech onboarding program or whatever it was. So it's been really nice to see this culture kind of build over the last year, and this now be included as a reason that people get promoted and elevated is because they're doing this and kind of contributing back to the company. The next thing that we did was we also created skills training related to coaching, mentoring, and teaching. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't kind of like throwing people into the fire, that we were hand-holding them a little bit through this. I don't know how many of you have worked with engineers, but this is, you know, public speaking, teaching, and these kinds of things are things that make them a little bit nervous. So we wanted to make sure that we supported them, that we hosted public speaking workshops, that we did dry runs, we gave them feedback so they could feel really comfortable while they were doing this. You know, we have lots of guides that we also created. So the screenshot over here on the side is a speaker guide for Tech Talks, which is like a TED style peer-to-peer learning program that we host at Peloton, so that people could actually learn these skills. And you know, it wasn't just kind of like, okay, throw them out there to the wolves, but very much, we're going to hold you through this and guide you through this process so that you're learning and growing through this process as well. And then finally, we also created a community around this. So we're a very Slack-heavy company. It's the main way that we communicate. So we've got a Slack channel where people can share tips and feedback, all that kind of stuff. We host different get-togethers and socials and meetings where people can do this. We also have swag. People love stickers. So getting a sticker that says instructor makes them really happy. So little things like that. And they can kind of identify each other and things like that, and really created this community. And so, you know, it's been about a year since we've kicked off this program. And so now we have 50 plus engineers that are a part of this network. And they all teach, write, and pair in all of our programs, which we've designed to be 100% peer-to-peer. So that includes our technical onboarding program. So every time a new engineer joins Peloton, they go through this program. We run it on a monthly basis. And that's completely peer-to-peer facilitated. So I don't actually facilitate or teach anything. We have all of our engineers come in and do that. Our tech talks, which is like, as I mentioned, a TED style talk that gets delivered monthly. And this one's really fun. People love this one because it allows people to learn things. Again, that concept of hyper relevant information, learn things that we can't actually talk about publicly because, you know, we've got patents and things like that, but about how we're applying technology and using technology and like the way that we're using computer vision and AI and, you know, our new kind of strength product and things like that, that they can't learn anywhere else. And they can only learn from engineers within the business, which is really exciting. And then finally, our incident management training program, which we run on a weekly basis. What happens if you do something and you ship a line of code and it breaks Peloton? And so we have engineers teach that as well, which is also really, really fun. So we're really excited about what we've seen for this program in the last year and kind of looking at year 2 and beyond. We're really thinking about how can we scale this and continue to bring this outside of engineering. So we started with engineering, as I mentioned. That's the group that my team really focuses on. And, you know, engineers they'll tell you they're quite cynical. And I think having this peer-to-peer network and leveraging kind of that buy-in from engineers was really, really important. But now the really exciting thing is we're seeing this across other learning groups at Peloton as well. So our leadership group who runs our leadership program, they've moved to a peer-to-peer learning model instead of bringing in external facilitators. And so we're really excited to kind of see that spread across the business. And scaling that and scaling this type of program is a very interesting and fun thing for me to think about. Which brings us to Jimmy, who's going to chat a little bit about peer-to-peer learning at scale.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. I know I already spoke up, but I'm Jimmy. I'm the head of Google's peer-to-peer learning program, which is called G2G or Googler to Googler. I was chuckling to myself as Thansha mentioned the swag because I realized I really should have worn some of my G2G swag. I mean, I'm sitting at home. I could have easily done that. But I'm so glad Thansha mentioned how she's thinking about scaling the program, because one of the things we've talked about is that we so rarely get to talk about our programs in this context where we can zoom in at what does it really take to get started and zoom out to, you know, what's the scale and what can this possibly look like. So hopefully we'll give y'all a view of both how you can get something like this started, and then also kind of the broader vision of how big it can get and where you can take it. Next slide, please. So as Thansha mentioned, Google is at a different, oh, there's no video. That's okay, I wasn't gonna play it anyway. But in case you're wondering why there's a weird blank half of the slide, there was a video there. But I want to be mindful of time because I know it's the end of the day on Friday at the end of a long week and a long conference, and I want to make sure there's time for questions. But so G2G, unlike the program at Peloton, G2G is actually content agnostic. So we were founded 15 years ago. The program turns 15 this year, with kind of a founding ethos of all learning is good learning. We want to create a learning culture and a learning organization here. So we are going to keep the barriers to entry as low as possible and lower the guardrails as much as possible so that anyone can contribute. And any Googler can teach any other Googler anything they want, with very, very few limitations on that. There are obviously some for legal reasons. But what we've achieved based on that philosophy is just a program of massive scale and the connection and instructor-led training and growth that comes with it. So you see here on this slide, at this point, there's over 13,500 Googlers who have contributed to the G2G program. And I want to make clear, that's not folks who have attended a class or attended coaching. Those are folks who have led a session of coaching or facilitation and really helped grow their fellow Googlers in that way. Next slide. Oh, there's a video. Look at that.
Do you want to play the video?
No, let's skip it. We can always go back to it, but I think it's more important to just keep it conversational, and then we can have time for questions later. So what I really want to get at this slide is, well, as it says, G2Gers lead 85% of all formal learning at Google. So it's really the rare occasion that we bring in an external facilitator or a full-time facilitator to lead learning, because we lean on this G2Ger network. And that includes all sorts of formal learning that's led by learning and development teams at Google. So in true Google fashion, it's a very atomized learning landscape. We did an audit a few years ago, and there were over 70 learning and development teams at Google. And that's largely because, any VP or director with some budget can create a learning and development team. But the commonality across all of them is that they all lean on this G2G network to deliver training. So that includes everything from new hire orientation, or at least until the pandemic, it included new hire orientation. It includes new manager training. It includes training that's led by what we call our sales mastery team, but you may be more familiar with the term like sales enablement. I think that's kind of the industry term. Engineering training, like Thansha was mentioning, kind of across finance academy, marketing academy, across functions, across levels. This is how we deliver training. In fact, we also use G2G volunteers to deliver our senior Noogler training. So for incoming VPs and directors, their first experience at the company is led by a G2G'er, which is actually a huge point of pride for us. Next slide. And when we think about how we got from kind of where they're at Peloton now to where we are today, you see here are the stats and the numbers behind that. And I want to call out a couple of things here. One is that after an initial ramp up period, we pretty quickly settled into about 10% of the company contributing to this program. I think that 13,500 number I gave you earlier is closer to 8%. It's dipped a little bit since the pandemic started. But generally 10% plus or minus contribute, and it shows just how organically it's been able to scale, even as Google has grown exponentially as a company. The other thing I really want to call attention to is the rating on the bottom. So Google's a very data-driven company. From the beginning, we started collecting data on what kind of experience are Googlers getting through G2G, and do they actually like the learning experience? How does it compare to external facilitators? And from the beginning, it compared very, very well and continues to. And it has a lot to do with what Thansha was talking about earlier about kind of that presumption of relevance. Right? Your defenses are immediately down as a learner. You're like, oh, this is somebody who understands the company, who's been where I am today, and is going to tell me something that's going to be useful. And we see that borne out in the numbers and the feedback scores that that our facilitators receive and have received over time. Next slide. Yeah. So there's another video, which I'm also going to encourage us to skip. But this is a quote that's pulled from it, which is from Stacy Sullivan, who is actually, as an interesting trivia question, the first HR employee at Google. Larry and Sergey hired her way back in the early days when they first, the story goes, reluctantly, begrudgingly agreed that they had to have an HR function. They hired Stacy, and she's still at the company. She's the head of, she's our chief culture officer now. And this is what she had to say about G2G, that G2G is a grassroots effort that produces or provides so much value and so much reach to Googlers and leaders. So it's something that's really permeated the DNA of the company in a way that's really, really incredible, and that leaders speak to the value that it delivers as well. You can skip this, that's a video. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this slide because, Thansha talked a little bit about what it's like to be at an engineering company. And one of the things that's interesting is a question I often get is like, okay, why are you necessary? Right? Like, we can just set up a tech platform that connects people with these learning experiences, and then the code does it. What do you do? Which is always a fun question to answer. Justify your existence. Okay, sure. And so I wanted to spend some time talking about the scaffolding and the supports that we offer to this 13,500 strong community. And it's largely in these buckets of development, recognition, and community. Development is important. So Thansha spoke a little bit about how they've been supporting their SME network. And we have very similar things. Obviously, it operates a little bit differently because it's at scale, but we have things like facilitation courses, like instructional design courses. We are trying to be thoughtful about pathways for facilitators to grow. So, somebody might want to get involved, but isn't ready to design their own course, right? Instructional design is hard. You all know that. So we have an entire library. I think it's about 80 activities strong now of off-the-shelf content that includes kind of presentation decks and facilitator guides on topics ranging from effective communication skills to giving and receiving feedback. So that's one thing we're thoughtful of. And then when you get into select facilitator communities, the Sales Mastery team is actually exceedingly good at this. And we're increasingly thinking about, our facilitator community for that senior Noogler orientation that I mentioned before, or new manager orientation, and how we can offer them additional supports above and beyond that. My colleague, Tani Hughes, runs our G2G coaching, which is our one-on-one program. And she's thinking about how do we support more of our G2G coaches to get external certifications through things like CTI and Hudson? And how do we, we've even been looking at how do we create the internal analog of a certification program, and what might that look like, for example. So we're really thinking about how we invest in this community and help them grow as they're helping their peers grow at Google, just as Thansha mentioned. Recognition is another really interesting one. I love that Thansha brought up the swag, because I would be embarrassed to tell you how much of my time a year or two ago I spent thinking about swag for people. It is a really important motivator, and we invest a lot in that. But one of the things I've been saying a lot to my colleagues recently is that first T-shirt means a lot. But this program is 15 years old, and some of the folks who are contributing have been contributing for over 10 years, and they don't need another T-shirt. And so how can we think about how does the recognition grow? How do we actually encourage them to deepen their relationship over time, deepen their engagement and their contribution, and show them recognition that correlates with that increased engagement and contribution. So that's another thing we're thinking about. Google has, for example, mechanisms to give financial incentives and bonuses. And that's something that for select facilitator communities we've played with. We did it at the end of the year last year, and copied managers on that. And so it was about not only the financial incentive, but also visibility to managers. And that's something that we also provide every year in the performance review cycle. We send out an email to every Googler who's contributed, and we say, here's how many sessions you've facilitated, here's how many Googlers you've reached, and here's how many hours, for example. And it helps them to kind of port that over into their performance review. And that's another that's very important to us as well, that Googlers think about these contributions in the context of their career and how it might help them grow. One thing I do want to say about recognition, and I'm actually not sure if this is true at Peloton, so maybe it's a question I'll kick back to Thansha, but all of our recognition is after the fact. None of our rewards are, hey, if you facilitate another 3 sessions, we'll send you a T-shirt. It's always, hey, we saw that you just facilitated 3 sessions. Thanks so much. Here's a T-shirt. And that has a lot to do with trying to maintain folks' intrinsic motivation for contributing to the program. And that's really important to us as well. We think it's related to the high quality. Drive by Daniel Pink was something of a founding text for the program. So we still hold on to that really tightly. And if there's ever a whiff of kind of rewarding people for contributing, we always have to answer, are we damaging kind of the intrinsic motivation to contribute? And lastly is community. This is a really interesting one because I'll be candid with you. We discovered a couple of years ago that we were thinking of community very, very differently than our users were thinking about community. So we always thought about this community of 13,500 Googlers who were contributing. And how do we connect G2Gers to one another? They have this shared interest in developing their peers and in learning. Certainly they'll want to connect. And we actually did some user research, and we went out and we did focus groups and we talked to some of the contributors. And they were like, no, when I think of community, I think of it as community with learners, with the folks that I'm facilitating and I'm teaching and I'm coaching. So this is something that, I'll be frank with you, we're actually pivoting only now into thinking about how do we provide additional supports to foster that kind of community and create additional connections that last beyond the session, that Thansha spoke so eloquently about the knock-on effects of those connections and how people might connect further on down the line, and the kinds of innovation and collaboration that can create as well. So that's a new area for us to explore that we're looking at as well. And that's the end of my section. Bansha?
Thanks, Jimmy. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our presentation. And there's, one main thing that we want to leave with you, if you take anything away from our talk, is that, regardless if you're a 100,000 person company like Google or a 100-person company, there's power in peer-to-peer learning. Google was founded, 1998, employs hundreds of thousands of people. Peloton was founded just 10 years ago. We employ thousands of people. But I think, from both our talk, Jimmy and I have both leveraged this power of internal experts to drive some pretty incredible business results that we're pretty proud of. So thank you all so much for coming, and we can turn it over for questions.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Really liked it. Yes, please. Susan.
Well, I've been waiting for this because...
maybe you should present yourself.
Oh, sorry. I am Susan Glazer, and this is Peter, and we've presented together, and we are great advocates of peer-to-peer learning and have been waiting for this. And a question we had before it is one that is actually amplified after hearing your talk. And that is, I know that I think it was Jimmy who said content agnostic. I understand the beauty of your peer-to-peer. And what I'm trying to figure out is, how do you stay content agnostic and still have consistency across it? Because it sounds like you are. And the two courses that I can relate to, because it's our content, would be, I want to say it exactly like effective communication skills and giving and receiving feedback. So are there some sort of shared competencies that no matter who your in-house person is, you get the same sort of education around giving and receiving feedback, communication skills, and any others?
Yeah, I'll let Jimmy take this one first, and I'll add on afterwards.
Sure. So let me speak to that a little bit, and then please let me know if I actually answered your question. I think there's a couple of things. One is that we do very little quality control. So when you talk about how do you
quality control,
very little quality control.
Yeah. Correct. So when you talk about consistency across, if I might be like a little bit provocative, I'll say we really don't do much to ensure that. We look at kind of the aggregate numbers and the satisfaction scores that I showed you earlier.
So Jimmy, if you have somebody doing, let's just call it giving and receiving feedback. Sure. Oh, now we get to see you. So somebody is doing giving and receiving feedback, and I might take that from one G to G-er and learn very different skill sets than if I happen to have another G to G-er.
Yes. Okay. So this is getting at the second part of my answer, which is something we're being increasingly thoughtful about, which is differentiated supports for different programs. So what does that mean? That means in G2G, I could teach a class in making pickles, right? However, the centralized learning and development team doesn't really care whether that's a very good class or not. There will always be space for that because that's part of the learning culture that we want to create. But it's kind of like, cool, man, have at it. Giving and receiving feedback is one that's really strategically important to the organization. So the supports that we put in place for that are higher. So for example, so that's one of the programs that I mentioned has the facilitator guide and the presentation guide. We also want to keep barriers to entry low. So folks who sign up to facilitate that course, they get a newsletter, they get pointed towards different development resources. And there was a time when we experimented with an automated email campaign that kind of, if you got lower facilitation scores, you were kind of nudged to maybe check out some development resources, but frankly, we weren't seeing the results that we wanted to with that, so we discontinued it. What we find is that because these are volunteers, how to put it, people don't like to volunteer for stuff they're not good at, right? It's kind of not fun to do. And so there's kind of a built-in intrinsic quality assurance mechanism. So the experience might be different. We hope that it's still good across the board, if that makes sense.
So as long as the satisfaction scores of the learners is, I got a lot out of this, this was interesting, it was worth my time, then however that particular G2Ger wants to do it, so be it.
Yeah, and in fact, sometimes the customization is a feature, not a bug.
A feature, not a...
sorry, that's a tech term. A feature, not a bug. Meaning the fact that somebody could take that off-the-shelf course and say, oh, but I'm giving this for a team in engineering, and I won't engage in the stereotyping that Dansha did before about engineers, but let's just say that I know that this particular team has more communication challenges than, say, a team in HR. Right? I might deliver giving and receiving feedback differently to that team based on what I know their needs are. And so that's actually a positive rather than a negative.
Thank you.
And I would say that, to Jimmy's point about it being a feature, I think that in particular is something that we've been trying to be very intentional about at Peloton. So we often think about, okay, Connected Leadership is a leadership program at Peloton. If we're teaching it mainly to an engineering audience, we're not going to have examples about, field ops, right? We're going to have engineering examples, and we actually swap those out. And we say to our subject matter experts that are teaching that, hey, swap these examples out for something that you've experienced as a leader. And we find that has been really, really impactful because, again, going back to that thing that we were talking about earlier, of that hyper relevant, hyper specific context you can only get from your peers. So if we're having an engineer teach leadership, then we're going to have them give leadership examples. And if it's a field ops leadership training, they're going to have field ops examples. And so people are going to walk away with some variations of skill, some variations in content, but the skill that they're learning is still the same, which is still leadership at Peloton. And then one thing that I'll add is Peloton's kind of taken a little bit of a different approach to this than Google. Peloton's we're very intense about our brand, and that translates internally as well. And so one of the things that we're in the midst of building is an entire design system for all of our learning teams. So things like the languages that, the way that we talk about things at Peloton in our learning programs, we want it to be consistent. And so I'm really excited about getting this in the hands of our subject matter experts and seeing how that kind of translates. I think, to Jimmy's point, there are some programs that we want to be very controlled about. Our technical onboarding program, very specific. We have very specific goals that directly impact the business. But our Tech Talks program, we can have a little bit more fun with. And subject matter experts can have a little bit more fun with too. So I think it's really thinking intentionally about it. And it's not, saying, okay, you have to do it this way or you have to do it this way. It's about trying to figure out, okay, for this program and the objectives that we're trying to achieve, what makes the most amount of sense, and then approaching it that way.
Yeah, and one last thing I would add to that really briefly is at Google, there's an ongoing, Fansha mentioned like certain subject areas where you might want to keep tighter reins on. There's an ongoing discussion about things like diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And for content like that, what's our level of trust in the volunteer community? What do we want to kind of make sure we're delivering in a very specific way? And so it's a really great question. I didn't mean to dismiss it, but be like, oh, it's actually a feature, not a bug. It's one we grapple with depending on the subject matter all the time.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the kind of reason that we are thinking about creating this design system was exactly for this, was because Peloton really wants to have diversity, equity, and inclusion at the core of its employee experience. And so, if we're building training on the tech learning team and they're building training on the field ops team, how do we make sure that we're, speaking to an audience with DE&I in mind? And so that was kind of the synthesis for bringing that up. So I'm glad you brought that point up as well, Jimmy.
So related question, stay with DEI for a moment. How do you inject new blood into a peer-to-peer system? How do you know what you don't know, I guess. How do you know you're not missing some cutting edge solutions that just don't exist in your peer? And by the way, I'm big on peer-to-peer. I'm not putting that down, but I do wonder about that question of getting new information in.
Yeah. Jimmy, can I take this one first? Okay.
Can I get the questioner's name real quick?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Peter Glazer. I'm actually the husband of the first questioner,
Okay.
Susan Glazer.
Got it. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it.
Dynamic duo. Love it. Yeah, so that's really interesting. And so I think at Peloton right now, a lot of the things that we're focusing on are within the company. But actually, a couple of weeks ago, I was having a conversation where I was talking to a product manager, and we were saying, you know what? Peloton's not really good at this one skill, and we need to think about bringing people in to do that teaching. And it was a really fascinating conversation because, of course, we can bring someone in and say, hey, like, let's teach our people this product strategy thing. But where I pushed back with the product manager was, if we're not going to start to do those things and introduce those into the business, if we don't have like a change plan, a change management plan prepared for after this, that learning is going to go lost, right? And so there are situations where we're thinking, okay, we don't do this well, and so we can't learn this internally. We need to bring that in. But in order for us to do that well, we need to take that extra step. It can't be like going to an external conference and coming back and then not applying it. And so we want to put those supports in ahead of that learning opportunity so that, we can bring someone in to teach people about this, and then our leaders are standing behind it. We're implementing it. We've thought about what this is going to look like at Peloton, and this is truly like a skill building exercise. And one of the models that we're experimenting with is, okay, so this is an external skill that we need to develop, and then pairing that with Peloton learning that's kind of always attached to this model. And one of the things that we want to explore in the future is, okay, if we send people to go learn skills externally, because the other thing that I think is interesting is sometimes it doesn't make sense for us to build the course internally, right? Like, I don't need to build a JavaScript 101 course because there's hundreds and thousands of things out there that do that very, very well. What we need to build is, how do we use JavaScript at Peloton? How do we use Python at Peloton? And that layer. And so I think that's something that we're thinking about as a learning team is, if we're bringing people in externally, if we're bringing context in from the external world, how do we make that relevant internally and leverage some of that peer-to-peer model? And it might look a little bit different, right? The first time we bring this external knowledge in, it might be a leader coming up and saying, okay, this person talked about this. This is how we're going to do this at Peloton. And then as that, continues to grow and this becomes a part of our DNA, it'll kind of graduate into, I think, eventually a peer-to-peer learning program. Jimmy, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think my answer is very similar, except it looks a little bit different at scale. By which I mean, there's two ways to think about like new and exciting in the peer-to-peer ecosystem, right? One is content, and the other is kind of like the training modality or methods. When it comes to content, what's great about peer-to-peer at Google and the fact that anybody can create content is that there's kind of a natural way for new ideas to come in. And in fact, it's way more responsive and quicker than any centrally managed curricula could be. Just as an example, I didn't talk about my professional background, but prior to Google, I was in management consulting at McKinsey. I came into Google on my first team. I was like, I think we could use some change management training. I threw together a course. I did it through G2G. And for months, I was getting requests from people I didn't know across the company being like, hey, I just saw your course listed. Could you give it to my team? Right. So then it's in the ecosystem and it's in the atmosphere. In fact, one of the things that I've just been tasked with, and it gives me palpitations, is actually trying to do a little bit of a data analysis and look at the entire G2G ecosystem and what training is being done. Because my boss's boss kind of had the same question that Thansha had, which was, what's the stuff we don't need to build for because it's already out there? It's already doing really, really well. And in this case, the scale is working against us because our data is a mess, but that's why I have a job. So no complaints. The other thing, though, is about in terms of like the modality, and are we keeping up with kind of the latest and greatest ways of delivering training? Thansha's better at this than we are. Where's like the flip side of the coin of we want to keep barriers to entry low is what's the easiest way to build training and deliver it. Throw together a slide deck, right? So in some ways, keeping barriers to entry low has kind of chained us to not the most innovative training modalities. That's something I would like to experiment more with, and I've been doing some investigation into that. But I'll admit that that's kind of a place where we have a ways to go.
You want this?
My name is Patrick. I have a question to you. How do you pair the people, coach and coach? Is it only problem? Is it problem based, or how does the pairing work?
Yeah, I can
This
start.
is specifically for one-on-one programs, or
Yes, maybe I don't. You haven't told us about what program you're providing. Is it a one-to-many program, or is it one-to-one programs? That would be interesting too.
Conchi, it sounded like you wanted to jump in first.
Yeah, I can jump in. So it depends on the program. So for our technical onboarding program and for our incident management program, those require like a very deep kind of expertise and a certain level of vetting, I would say. So we work really closely with our engineering leaders to identify, who those people are, and that makes sense. And that's a one-to-many program. Same thing with our Tech Talks. It's one-to-many, but because Tech Talks is meant to be a little bit more fun and, engineering leaders are less involved in that program. So really involving leadership and management to understand, okay, who are the people that are truly the experts in this space that we can put in front of a group. But we do have, and we've recently launched 2 pilots on coaching and, a mentorship and a shadowing, like a job shadowing coaching program. And that pairing, so because they're pilots, we're managing manually. So we had people fill out, like a questionnaire, both the mentee and the mentor, and said, okay, I want to learn this. And then, people were like, these are my skill sets. This is what I can mentor in. And we did a manual pairing. But the really exciting thing is we've been exploring there's been some pretty interesting innovations in technology in this space. And so there's a platform called Skills Exchange that we're looking at bringing in next year that essentially creates this marketplace for peer-to-peer learning, which is really fun. And so basically I could go on and say, I want to learn leadership and, I work in software and these are my skills and I want to be an engineering manager one day, or I want to be a staff engineer or principal engineer. And then Jimmy could kind of post in the same marketplace and say, hey, like I'm Jimmy. I am interested in mentoring people that are looking to move into engineering, leadership, and I can do this 3 hours a month or something like that. And then I would be able to like go and click Jimmy and message him. So we're really excited about piloting that technology because I think that'll help us scale the program, because right now we're doing a lot of manual matching. And that's okay when you're doing a pilot and it's like, a couple hundred people, but I think across the thousands of folks that work in technology at Peloton would be a little bit difficult. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. Jimmy?
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's largely how it works at Google. So we have both one-to-one and one-to-many programs. For most one-to-many programs, I go into our internal LMS. I say I'm looking for a course in change management, and I see what search results come up. And if there's one that matches my time zone and that I want to sign up for, I sign up for it, right? So there isn't really a matching function. It's more like a marketplace. Coaching is similar, except that all the coaches have been through some vetting. So that's our one-on-one program. So they kind of are properly trained, and they kind of put up a profile that says, I'm in this org. This is, the type of coaching client I'm looking for, the type of coaching I specialize in. And then you can try to find one that's a good match. But it's a little bit more free marketplace.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I was curious about, so you said that you started a year ago and that you're implementing this pilot now. What was or is the learning culture at Peloton? Like, is it already established, or is this peer-to-peer method building that culture?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. So I would say this is definitely building the culture. So before Peloton, and where I did a lot of my kind of experimentation with peer-to-peer learning, was I worked at Shopify that has a very, very strong learning culture kind of embedded into my former CEO has big learner. We had like, it was the kind of company where you'd have like libraries and things like that throughout the business. Peloton's very different. It doesn't have that strong learning culture, but something that, you know, the business really wants and wanted to invest in. So when I started a year ago, that was one of my mandates, to think about how do we bring this into our culture and bring this learning culture forward. Peloton's got a very you can imagine we're fitness, a lot of like celebration kind of culture. But when you're a technology company, you have to be able to celebrate failures. You have to be able to celebrate failure as a way of learning and all of that kind of stuff, and to encourage things like risk taking. And so that was something our leadership team really wanted to do. And so we're really thinking about peer-to-peer learning as creating that learning culture. Like, we don't want people to think about learning as something that they have to do, like they have to take a huge time out of their day and like go somewhere or like to do. We want people to think about learning happening all the time, that they could go to a meeting and learn. If they make a mistake, they can learn from that mistake. Like, that's the kind of culture that we really want to kind of breed. And having recently just launched our incident management training program, that was very interesting, because you can imagine if you're an engineer and you deploy a line of code and it takes down Peloton. I don't know how much you guys know about Peloton members, but they're into it. So Twitter kind of goes off, you know? And so that can be very stressful for an engineer, especially if you're a junior engineer and you're like, oh, you know? And so we really want to think about, how do we create a blameless culture? How do we help our engineers think about this as learning, that, hey, if you deploy a line of code and it breaks something, what can that teach us about the way that we've built our technology? What can that teach us about our architecture and like our gateways and things like that? And so this is kind of, you know, and so we've set it up so that you have, you know, our site reliability engineers doing this teaching, and it's not like the CEO or the chief technology officer or like the SVP of engineering coming down and being like, this is how you do this, you did this wrong. It's more like, hey, this is how we create reliable services and systems. And we know that things will break, because that's just how technology works. And, you know, we want to keep moving quickly, and we don't want that to stop us from building, but this is what you do when it does. And so really thinking about creating that learning culture through peer-to-peer learning, which has been so far really exciting to see. We've seen a lot of reduction in like a thing that we measure, which is mean time to mitigation. So how quickly we can get people back online and back on their bikes or treads or apps or whatever.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to finish. So Jimmy, thank you. Thank you, Tansha. I think that we got many takeaways from this presentation. So I'm sure, are you staying here?
Thank you, and thank
Okay.
everyone for the great questions as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I'm happy to stick around too. I don't know if there's any way to make that work.
I can make you a coffee if you want.
I'm a tea drinker, but thanks anyway.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Tansha, and thank you, everyone. Okay, thank you. Bye.